Good evening, members of the African American Genealogy Society, guests and friends. I am so honored to be able to speak to you today. And I'm going to talk to you about my journey doing my family's genealogical history. But I want to give you this presentation in three parts. Part one is my backstory, how I got there, and who helped me to get there, telling my story. Part two, I want to give you the history of the black press, because the black press was such a powerful tool then and now in genealogical research. In part three, I want to tell you about the challenges now that the black press is experiencing, and I want to give a challenge to you at the end. But before I get into those three sections, I want you to watch a very short video. It's about 2 minutes. That gives you a little background about the black press. Too long have others spoken for us. I know this was very low in volume, but this is one powerful video, Soldiers Without Swords, because it speaks to the voices of African Americans and how they had no voice in the beginning, and the black press gave them a voice. And what you may not have heard is that before the African American press, we were here, but it's like we were never born. It was never recorded. Our deaths were never recorded. Our names were often never recorded. But the black press changed all of that. And that's why this is such a powerful tool in African American genealogy research. So I want to give you a little background about the African American genealogy research. And I would just want to note those things again that were so important in Soldiers Without Swords, because it lists, I want to go through each thing, if you will go to the next slide for me. And this is where my journey started, right here. My personal journey started, and I want to give you the backstory of how this journey all started for me. It was such an incredible ride for me. In 2012, I received a call from a friend. Just a casual conversation. We weren't talking about genealogy. We weren't talking about history or family. We were just talking. And this friend of mine said, Pauline, by the way, I forgot to tell you, there's some information on the internet about your dad. And I took pause. long pause, because my dad had been dead since 1978. And even when he was alive, he was a very quiet man. And he was gone from my life for a good part of it because he was a singer and he traveled for 30 years. So he was in and out of our lives. But in 2012, I found out who this man really was. And my friend said to me, Pauline, hang up the phone, because he could tell I didn't believe it. He said, hang up the phone and Google your dad's name. So I hung up immediately and Googled Emmanuel Mansfield tenor, because that's what he was. He was a Negro tenor, a classical singer. And this photo right here is the first thing that came up when I Googled his name. And I was just absolutely stunned because I had never seen this picture. And this picture is from 1929. And these gentlemen standing in front of this building, this is the African American News Building in Baltimore, Maryland. This is my dad, right here. I had never seen a picture of my dad as a young man because my parents married when they were older. They had children much later than that. So for me, all of my life, he was an old man. I never saw him I never even envisioned him as a young man. And this newspaper article introduced me to a man I had never seen. And I really love this particular photo in this article. He took many years trying to build his life because he was a farm boy, grew up in the country in a town I told Barbara was as big as this room. But he found his way to the University of Maryland, which then was called Princess Anne, Maryland. And that's where his life started, his journey to live out his dream. Everybody has one. And even as a poor man with no money and no one to support him, he lived out his dream the rest of his life. So this article right here started me on my journey. And back to the video again, this incredible video. And you can see it on PBS, actually. For those of you who have interest in history, I would really encourage you to go to YouTube, stream it on Amazon, Netflix. All of them had this video, full video in its entirety. It's about 1 hour and 50 minutes, and it's worth every second to read it. Because the black press offered a connection with the past for so many people. And one of the things that touched me so deeply was the news in the papers regarding freedom. But because before the Civil War, a lot of people had no voice. They just had a long, endless job that seemed like it would never go away. And I wanted to share with you real quick the power of the paper after freedom. After the Emancipation Proclamation, I'm going to read 2 articles. These are actual articles that were in a New Orleans paper called the Southwestern. And it was in a section of the newspaper called Lost Friends. We don't need it anymore. But in 1870, 1880, 1890, they needed that. And this first one says, Dear Editor, I wish to inquire for my husband, George Washington Steptoe. He belonged to Dr. McFarland of New Orleans. When we were separated about 34 years ago, we had a daughter. Her name was Mary Steptoe, who is now with me. Any information of him will be thankfully received. Address me at Pittsfield, Texas, in care of Reverend A.C. Copeland. And it has her name at the bottom, Creasy Steptoe. That was just extremely moving for me. And another one reads, Dear Editor, I wish to inquire about my people. I left them in a trader's yard in Alexandria with Mr. Franklin. They were to be sent to New Orleans. Their names were Jarvis, Moses, George, and Maria Gaines. Any information of them will be thankfully received. And it gives the address where to send it. This was Celia Rhodes who wrote that. actually wrote that in 1880 in the Southwestern newspaper. And these kind of editorials, news, letters to the editor in newspapers go on and on and on. There's so many of them. And I found it very interesting that there was a note attached to it. And this note basically says, we publish these letters to the editor at no charge, and it implores the preachers in the pulpit to please let the editor know if anybody is reunited as a result of this article. We take freedom for granted. But this is just extremely powerful, and if there was not a vehicle for people to do that, many of these people would have never found each other. So freedom news was just a critical thing. And as those who went into freedom after emancipation, they were able to purchase land for the first time, so you could see legal notices. There was news of death, so people would know if people were lost. There were births, there were marriages, there were business chronicles, and there were family photos. And the family photos are the things that really, really helped me. And when I say family photos, there were not only photos I found of my dad, but of my dad's friends. And in my family, friends were family. And in my family now, friends are still family. So it was really enlightening to me to see, for example, there was a Mr. Lashley who sang with my dad, and occasionally he would come home with my dad. I remember Mr. Lashley very well, and his picture was in one of these newspapers. So these are just small samplings of the newspapers that I found about my dad, and this is a very, very small sampling. I have a whole book full of them that I now keep because I want my children to have them, and I want my nieces and nephews to be aware of who their grandfather actually was. The black press, it gave a voice to the voiceless, and that's a powerful thing. Now, the history of the black press, I found this fascinating because I just love history. It just amazed me that the first African-American publication was in 1827. And you know why that amazed me? Because that was during the time of slavery. So how in the world would they be allowed to create black press in chains and at the end of a whip? But many free blacks lived above the Mason-Dixon line, which divided the North and South. And so those in the North were often very progressive. And the first African-American newspaper was Freedom's Journal in 1827. The second one was a journal done by a name of a person we all know as African-American, and that's Frederick Douglass. And he started his newspaper in 1847. And then the newspaper that helped me the most in my journey, the African-American News, began in 1862. And it still exists today. It's a powerful newspaper. As a matter of fact, it's the longest running African-American newspaper in the world. And it still exists. The home office is in Baltimore. And I got a number of my articles from their paper, and I used a number of them in this book. And I will tell you how I was able to get them later on in just a few minutes. And then post-slavery, the boom started. I'm just going to name a few, because actually there were, between 1827 and the late 1990s, there were 5,529 newspapers of one kind or another. We're talking about community newspapers, church newspapers, university newspapers, and it goes on, but all African American. But the ones that we may know, California Eagle, because after slavery, a lot of people migrated to the West. Everybody didn't come north. Some went west. Then there was the Baltimore African American, and in 1892, they got a strong foothold in the Washington, Maryland, and Virginia area. And then there was the Chicago Defender. How many of you have heard of the Chicago Defender? an incredible paper. And the Chicago Defender, if you'll pause for a minute here, Michael, was really critical in African American lives because the owner and publisher of the Chicago Defender wanted the Chicago Defender to go outside of the Chicago city limits. And why? Because they wanted to know they wanted the people in the South to know about freedom. So they gave the papers to the porters on the trains. And the porters were those people who made sure that news got into the South, because it was still illegal in some places for African Americans to read. You know, people thought there would be an overthrow of the government if we read too much. So the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier were newspapers that were sent into the South clandestinely. But it made a big difference because people started to read that news and said, I can be free too, and started the Great Migration to the North. And in 1928 was the Atlanta Daily World, right here in our hometown. Still exists today. And those of you who have stopped reading African American news, start reading. There's still news in there that we need to know. So there are several depositories for African American newspapers that genealogists, those who are doing family searches, need to know. The library is one of the best ones, and you can use that free. The state archives, local historical societies, town historian offices, microfilm, which is an old-fashioned method, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And the largest holder of microfilm is the Church of Latter-day Saints, which is the Mormons in Salt Lake City, Utah. And then there are actual newspaper publishers' offices. So what did I use? What methods did I use? I used many, and the newspapers played a huge part for me. But I contacted local libraries. There is a minimal charge just for copies, just to make copies. I also contacted newspaper companies, not only in my dad's hometown of Virginia, but also in my town in Maryland, because there were newspapers that carried articles about me there. And you can get photocopies or PDF versions. Sometimes you do have to pay for them. And then there are online copies. There's several online depositories. Most of them charge. And it varies from one to the other how much they do charge. So there can be some expense to this research. And there's the Library of Congress, which is a huge depository for African American newspapers. And they do have online access, or you can actually go to the Library of Congress and get the copies yourself. And that would be in Washington, D.C. Microfilm, I mentioned. Microfilm is kind of an old-fashioned method, but it still works. It reminds me kind of the old computers we used to have back in the day. Everybody thinks of laptops, but back in the day, a computer took up a quarter of a room. And the microfiche machines and microfilm machines are huge. They're very cumbersome. You have to go through one slide at a time. It's very labor intensive, but it's a good source because they have chronicled so many newspapers with microfilm and microfiche. The thing that I found interesting about microfilm is that it has a long shelf life, but it's becoming obsolete because it is old and it's very expensive to replace the parts in the machine. And of course we have digital copies, and digital copies we take for granted last forever, but they don't. They only have a shelf life of 25 years. So you have to continuously replenish them, if you will. But it's good to have them somewhere digitized because paper goes away. It will not last forever. If you go on to my next slide. So, and this is my last slide. There are challenges to African American press, big challenges. And I just want to say very quickly that, you know, integration did some wonderful things. We all agree with that. But one of the things that it also did is it took away some of the things that we had. And one of them was the African American press. Remember I said there were 5,529 copies between 1827 and the late 1990s? Now there are only hundreds of them. That's a huge difference. And why? Because with integration, African Americans were able to go into bigger white newspapers and get jobs, which was a good thing. But it made the black newspapers go away, so they're faded. Many historical African American papers did not survive. So I challenge all of you, if you have relatives that are hoarding old newspapers, don't throw them in the dumpster, look at them first. There could be historical information there for you. Give them to a historical society or to a university and let them save what is valuable and important, because it is the voice for the voiceless. And our theme today is ancestry on my mind. Keep ancestry on your mind, because we all have a story to tell. I told mine, and I'm going to continue to tell it. So make sure you start telling yours. Keep every photo, every newspaper, every letter of your grandmothers, your aunties. It is so important. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share methods of researching your family, and I implore you to do that. Thank you. Before Barbara comes back, I'm going to give you 5 minutes, Mr. Timer, to ask any questions that you may have about my research or about articles that I may have collected, whatever you might have. Yes, Octavia?
I just want to applaud you again for what you've done.
Thank you.
I remember we were on a trip together for Capital City Bank, and we had gone down, was it Savannah?
I think so.
Savannah, and we were sitting near the pool and get ready for lunch, and you were talking about the information that they'd given you about your father. I also told you that Dr. Herbert,
Oh, yes.
who had been his accompanist, Zelda, my girlfriend Zelda, knew him. And there was some more information that I'm sure Morris Brown has as well. I don't know if you're able to go back and look at their files, but I bet you it's something there.
It's possible. It's an ongoing journey.
Yeah.
So I continue my
This
search.
was part of that, Dr. Herbert's piano
Right.
cottage, whatever you want to call it. But when you told me about, I mentioned it to her, and she knew that Dr. Herbert had been his accomplice.
Right.
And she told me that.
Right. She and I did talk.
Yeah.
So,
and I gave you her number.
Right. It can go on and on and on.
Yeah. So again, great information, and I can't help but to think that there's something that I need to pull from my family as well.
You do.
And there are, so many. I've connected all 4 sizes of my family, and I just want to make sure that I get as much information as I can about those 4 sizes.
We don't want our history to go in the grave.
No, we don't.
One of these days, we're going to go further than 1800s, because it appears that Black Americans do not know the genealogy or their history prior to 1619. All the universities, Morehouse, Clark, Spelman, when you talk about history of Black people, they can only go as far as 1619. You know what that date is. That's the Atlanta trade ship of slaves. But prior to that, we have no clue. And that's a task that I plan to take on, because we don't know our roots past 1,000 years prior to 1619. It is a big black hole.
Right.
So it would take someone like myself who have done extensive study in the scripture, because the scripture is not only a spiritual book, it's a history book. But the state don't want to include the Bible as a history book. And that's a big problem, because we don't know. We don't know our ancestors past 1619. We don't have no clue. So that's something I plan to explore as long as I'm here, so we will have roots further than slavery. Okay?
Thank you. Sheila, and then Derek.
My question is, from the time you heard the information about your father in 2012, how long did it take you to collect all of the information to finalize it in your book? And I know you're still doing some more studies and finding out more information, but how
That's
long?
a good question.
Did it take?
It took me from 2012 to probably 2014 to connect all the dots. Because what I had to do is, once I found all these articles, it was just an avalanche of information. I had to sort it, and I took the information I found and lined up all the news articles by date. So I was following my dad from this spot to Boston, to New York, to California, to Seattle, to Puerto Rico, so I could see where he was and what he was doing. And in some of the articles, it actually gave information about my entire family, because it gave his history, where he went to school, who his parents were, what he had done to get to where he was. So I had to order them. I had to put them together like a puzzle. And that took a very long time. And then I added in other information that I found at graveyards, that I found in local newspapers from my hometown, that I found in the family Bible that I didn't even know existed. So it probably took me 2.5 years to get to that spot. And I finished the book in 2015.
How effective was the family Bible in your research?
Oh, very. Because in the old days, I don't know how many of your families has actually kept, that was the record. Because someone would meticulously write every birth, every death, every marriage, didn't miss one. We don't do that anymore, which is sad. We need to write things down. I now keep, now this might sound a little morbid, but I now keep every funeral program for everybody who dies in my family, because I was amazed at how much information I got from the funeral program. So it took me a good while to just collect it, sort it, then write it. Any other questions? I think we're on red. I'll take that one. Derek, you were the one. If you don't mind, Retha.
Sometimes when we start researching, we find out stuff we don't want to
Correct.
see. How did you feel when you started your journey?
You mean, did I find out any information I...
Well, how did you feel, or did you find anything that shocked you?
No. No, I found things that really made me very happy. You know, I didn't really know my dad, not really. I knew who he was, but I didn't know him as a person. And I found out that he was really a far more extraordinary person than I ever knew. And it just kind of made me sad that we didn't know each other before he left this world. And that was one reason why it wasn't important to me to do any research about the Mansfield. I mean, he was gone. I thought he was the last of them. No cousins. What was I looking for? But you never know what's out there. So, can I get in Retha's question? And the red light went on, so we need to allow time for, ask it.
Okay, I was just gonna ask, you know, like if someone is on this journey, do you recommend the Ancestry.com?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I got so much information, and there are many like Ancestry, but I found that Ancestry.com had the most accurate information. You know, you go to some of these sites, and they really have been, their information is fueled by people who just put information they think is true on them. But Ancestry.com is much more accurate. Oh yes, I use that a lot. And for those of you who don't know, you can go to the library and use Ancestry.com for free. I paid hundreds of dollars to use it. So that was the last question. I'm glad we got that one in. All right, thank you, and then we'll go to the next section.
If anyone doesn't have paper or pencil,